I gave up everything to build his empire. Then he traded me for a trophy wife. They say that love is blind, but looking back, I realize it wasn't just my eyes that were covered. It was my entire soul. For years, I lived in a gilded cage of my own making, convinced that the greatest achievement of my life was not the empire I inherited, but the man I chose to build a future with. I was Elena, a woman born into a world of immense wealth and privilege, surrounded by people who measured worth in stocks, bonds, and lineage. When I met David, a struggling, ambitious mechanic who didn't know the difference between a hedge fund and a houseplant, my family practically shrieked in horror. They told me he was a predator hunting for a trophy. They warned me that his dream of starting his own automotive engineering firm was just a fancy way of saying he wanted to live off my inheritance. But I was young, I was rebellious, and most importantly, I was hopelessly, foolishly in love. I thought I was proving them wrong, choosing a simple life of passion over the sterile comfort of my trust fund. Little did I know, I wasn't choosing love. I was handing the architect of my own destruction the very blueprints he needed to tear my life apart. The tragedy of my choices began with the quiet, gradual stripping away of my identity. Within months of meeting David, I had made the ultimate leap of faith. My parents, true to their ultimatum, had officially severed my access to the family trust. I left the penthouse, the designer clothes, and the country club, moving into a drafty two-bedroom apartment that barely had heat in the winter. It was supposed to be our fortress, the place where we would build a dynasty from nothing. I was exhilarated. I spent my days working 2 administrative jobs just to keep our electricity on, while David spent his nights in a rented, greasy garage, obsessing over the patents for a high-efficiency fuel injection system that he was convinced would change the automotive industry forever. I believed in him with an intensity that bordered on the religious. Every spare cent I earned went directly into his dream. I managed his books, drafted his business plans, and leveraged my elite social connections, the very people I had supposedly walked away from, to secure the critical initial contracts with regional shipping fleets. I remember the night we landed the first major deal. We sat on our kitchen floor, eating lukewarm pizza, David's face alight with the kind of raw, untethered ambition I had fallen in love with. "I couldn't have done this without you, Elena," he'd said, holding my hands in his grease-stained palms. "Once we make it, I promise you, you'll never have to worry about another bill for the rest of your life. This is our empire." That was the line that hooked me for a decade. Our empire. I threw myself into the grind with everything I had. I navigated the complex world of industrial logistics, negotiated with stubborn vendors, and mastered the art of corporate networking. While David focused on the engineering, I focused on the survival of the entity. I sacrificed my own professional aspirations, my own hobbies, and my own health to ensure that his name, his vision, and his success became the reality he had promised. I was the silent engine behind his public persona. When he finally got the media profile in the Business Journal, when he was invited to speak at the National Industry Summit, I was the one standing in the wings, holding his jacket, managing his schedule, and making sure the world saw him exactly the way he wanted to be seen. I was perfectly content to be the shadow, as long as the sun was shining on us both. I didn't need the glory. I just needed to know that the man I had given up my entire world for was the partner I believed him to be. I was so blinded by my own narrative of us that I missed the subtle, chilling shift in his demeanor. I didn't see the way he began to look at me, not with gratitude, but with an impatient, growing irritation. I didn't notice the way he stopped asking for my advice on corporate strategy, or how he started spending more time in the city, attending exclusive industry galas where spouses were rarely invited. I was busy managing the life I had built for him, entirely unaware that the man I had raised from nothing was already looking for a way to trade me in. I thought we were growing together, building a legacy that would stand the test of time. I didn't realize that in David's eyes, I wasn't his partner anymore. I was a relic of his humble beginnings, a reminder of the time when he was nobody. And the cruelest, most unexpected truth. I was the only person in the world who had the keys to the kingdom he was now ready to steal from me. Within 3 years, the landscape of our lives had shifted dramatically. David's company, Sterling Dynamics, had ceased to be a garage-based experiment and had become a dominant force in the regional automotive sector. The fuel injection system, patent he had obsessed over, turned out to be the breakthrough the industry had been desperate for. Major manufacturers were lining up to license his technology, and the capital influx was staggering. I was the silent partner who made it possible. While David stepped into the spotlight, giving interviews and posing for industry magazines, I was the one working 18-hour days to ensure the corporate structure remained bulletproof. I handled the legal team, navigated the volatile tax landscape, and cultivated relationships with the venture capitalists who viewed me as the real stability behind the operation. I didn't care about the accolades or the fame. I was genuinely proud of David. I believed we were partners in the truest sense of the word. I was building a future for the family I envisioned, believing David felt the exact same way. But success, I soon learned, is a potent intoxicant. As the bank account swelled with millions, the man who had sat on our kitchen floor eating lukewarm pizza and promising me an empire began to fade away. In his place emerged a version of David I didn't recognize. He started arriving home late, his clothes smelling of expensive cologne and unfamiliar perfumes. He became dismissive of our shared history, frequently rolling his eyes when I brought up our humble beginnings. The warmth in his eyes was replaced by a cold, calculating detachment. He started distancing himself from our social circle, claiming he needed to network with high-value individuals who understood the demands of his new station. "Elena, you're stuck in the past," he'd sneer during arguments, his voice cold and patronizing. "You don't understand how the world works now. I have to surround myself with people who are on my level, not people who remind me of where I came from." It was a cutting remark, intended to minimize my contribution and silence my concerns. I was his wife, his partner, and the primary reason he was standing on a stage at all, yet he began to view me as an anchor, a relic of his life as a struggling mechanic that he was eager to prune from his public image. The betrayal finally came into sharp focus when I started seeing the patterns. It wasn't just the late nights or the defensive attitude. It was the financial trail he thought I was too removed from the business to track. David had begun funneling company funds into a private account he'd set up, ostensibly for consulting fees. I grew suspicious, not because of paranoia, but because I knew the business inside out. There was no legitimate consulting firm he was working with. I hired a private investigator, not out of malice, but out of a desperate need to confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. The report was concise, brutal, and entirely damning. David was having an affair with a socialite named Vanessa, a woman who came from a high-status family very much like the one I had left behind for him. The surveillance photos were a nightmare in Technicolor. David and Vanessa at luxury hotels, David buying her expensive, rare gifts with funds I knew were siphoned from our corporate accounts, and David, in an overheard audio recording, laughing about how he was almost ready to shed his old skin and leave me for someone who truly belonged in his world. I spent 3 days in a state of absolute, paralyzed shock. I felt the physical weight of my heart sinking, the reality of my sacrifice turning to ash in my mouth. I had given up my family, my inheritance, and my own professional potential for a man who viewed me as a disposable stepping stone. He wasn't just planning to divorce me. He was planning to systematically dismantle the life I had helped him build, frame me as the out-of-touch spouse, and walk away with the lion's share of the empire. He had spent 10 years convincing me that we were building our future. The truth was, he was building his future, using me as the foundation, and preparing to kick the ladder out from under me the moment he reached the top. As I sat in the dark of our sprawling, multi-million-dollar master bedroom, looking at the photos of him with Vanessa, the initial wave of grief washed over me, only to be overtaken by a cold, hard tide of rage. He wanted a trophy wife from a high-status family. He wanted to discard the woman who had wiped the grease from his hands and the debt from his books. He had made a fatal error in judgment. He assumed that because I had stepped back to support his ascent, I had lost the skills that made me a titan of industry in the first place. He thought I was a soft, sentimental relic who would accept a humiliating divorce settlement out of shame. He was wrong. I was still the woman who had navigated my father's cutthroat corporate world, and I knew exactly how to dismantle a hostile takeover. David wanted to play the game of corporate and social climbing. Fine, I would show him exactly how the game was played, and I would make sure he was the one left with nothing. I sat at my laptop and began to systematically pull the threads he thought were hidden. I logged into our corporate accounts, accessed the internal server logs he thought were encrypted, and began printing the evidence of his fraud, his embezzlement, and his systematic attempts to minimize my ownership stake in the firm. I had the paper trail, the digital breadcrumbs, and the leverage. I didn't reach for the phone to cry. I reached for my lawyer's contact information. David thought he was trading up, looking for a life he believed he had earned. He didn't realize that the very foundation he stood upon was mine, and I was about to pull it out from under him. He believed I was an anchor. I was about to prove that I was the entire ship, and he was nothing but a passenger who had forgotten his place. I didn't confront David. I didn't break down in tears or demand an explanation. Instead, I retreated to my home office, shut the heavy oak door, and locked it. In the silence of that room, the heartbroken wife evaporated, and the strategist I had been before I gave up my career returned with a vengeance. David believed he had succeeded in marginalizing me because I had stepped back from the front lines of our business. He assumed that my absence from the office meant I had lost my touch, my leverage, and my understanding of the corporate landscape. He was wrong. I was still the woman who had negotiated multi-million-dollar acquisition deals. I was still the woman who understood the intricacies of corporate governance, asset valuation, and the lethal game of board politics. If David wanted to trade our marriage for a trophy life, he would soon find that he had gambled his entire foundation on the assumption that I would remain a passive spectator. I spent the next 3 days in a state of hyper-focused clarity. I didn't reach out to him or change my daily routine, even though every instinct screamed at me to confront him. I played the role of the oblivious, supportive wife to perfection. I made him his coffee in the morning, smiled when he talked about his long hours at the office, and maintained the domestic facade that kept him comfortable and complacent. He grew increasingly arrogant and reckless, completely blinded by his own sense of victory. He believed he was outmaneuvering me, which made him sloppy. He left his laptop unlocked on the kitchen island. He grew careless with his phone. He even bragged about his growing influence in circles where I knew he had no real standing. I systematically began the audit of his secret life. I didn't just need to know about the affair, I needed to document the financial betrayal. I accessed our corporate server through an encrypted, external terminal. I traced the unauthorized transfers from the company's operating accounts, identified the shell LLCs he had created, and mapped out the trail of funds he was siphoning. He had been aggressive, moving larger and larger sums of money, assuming that the sheer volume of our corporate revenue would make his small, consistent thefts invisible. He didn't realize that I had an automated alert system set to flag any discrepancy exceeding $5,000, a system I had implemented years ago, which he had never bothered to investigate. I downloaded every transaction, every offshore transfer, and every fraudulent invoice. I had a digital ledger of his corruption that was not only sufficient for a divorce proceeding, but was legally robust enough to serve as the basis for a criminal fraud indictment. But leverage, in this case, was not just financial. I knew the socialite he was seeing, Vanessa. I reached out to an old contact, a fixer I had known from my high society days, and requested a detailed dossier on her. It wasn't hard to find the cracks in her armor. She was heavily leveraged, her family estate was drowning in tax debt, and her high-status lifestyle was being propped up by the very company David was currently looting. When the dossier landed on my desk, I felt the cold, sharp satisfaction of a trap being set. David thought he was building a future with a woman who had money and influence, when in reality, he was tethering himself to a sinking ship. She was just as much of a predator as he was, and the moment his access to my assets failed, her interest in him would evaporate. I didn't reach for the phone to cry. I reached for my lawyer's contact information. I consulted with one of the top divorce and litigation attorneys in the country, a man who had successfully dismantled the careers of titans far more powerful than David. I didn't go in with a sob story, I went in with a mountain of evidence. I don't want a long, drawn-out battle, I told him, sliding the encrypted drive across his desk. I want to dismantle the entire operation from the inside out, and I want him to sign it all away. I want a post-nuptial adjustment that retroactively covers his fraudulent actions and effectively strips him of any claim to the equity I founded. I want to leave him with exactly what he had when I met him: nothing. My attorney looked over the files and his eyes widened. Elena, this is not just grounds for divorce. This is criminal fraud. We can hold this over his head, but if he knows how much evidence we have, he will panic and hire a team to fight it. We need to be surgical. He won't know, I said. He thinks I'm a housewife. He thinks I'm the woman who gave up her career to be his silent support. He won't see this coming until the moment it's over. I spent the following week working with my attorney to structure the final trap. We created a corporate reorganization document, a massive, dense stack of papers that looked like a routine adjustment to the company's share structure. I framed it as a way to protect his assets from an impending government audit of his sector, using the exact kind of professional language he would find tedious to read. I knew David. I knew his arrogance would keep him from reading a 200-page document. He wanted to be a CEO, but he never wanted to do the work of one. I planned the dinner party for the end of the month. I told him it was a milestone celebration for the company's growth, and that I wanted all of his key partners, and Vanessa, of course, to be present. He was thrilled. He couldn't wait to show off his new life, his new woman, and the empire he thought he had successfully stolen. As I finalized the plans for that evening, I looked at my reflection in the mirror of my bathroom. The woman looking back at me was no longer the one who had sacrificed everything for love. She was a woman who had looked into the abyss of betrayal and had come back with a plan. The stage was set. The guests were invited. The legal trap was prepared. David believed he was walking toward the culmination of his grand plan. He had no idea that I was the one holding the curtain and I was about to drop it. The day of the board meeting arrived with a crisp, biting cold that seemed to mirror the atmosphere I had cultivated within the walls of Sterling Dynamics. For weeks, I had meticulously orchestrated the environment, leading David to believe that the company's impending government audit was a genuine threat that required an immediate and drastic restructuring of our corporate assets. I had fed his ego, allowing him to take the lead in protecting our future, while he remained blissfully ignorant of the fact that the trap had been sprung the moment he signed the documents I had prepared. I arrived at the headquarters at 8:00 a.m., dressed in a sharp, structured charcoal suit that commanded respect. I didn't see David until he walked into the boardroom at 9:00 a.m. Flanked by his legal team and Vanessa, who was acting as his consultant. He looked smug, radiating the confidence of a man who believed he was about to finalize his grand exit from our marriage and my company. He had no idea that I had spent the entire morning briefing the senior board members, the real power players who had been with me since the garage days, on the reality of his actions. David took his place at the head of the table, his smile wide and theatrical. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice echoing with practiced authority. "As you are all aware, the regulatory climate has shifted, and we need to move swiftly to protect our assets. I have proposed a total restructuring of the company's equity that will secure our future and minimize our exposure to the upcoming audit." He looked at me, a brief, patronizing glance, before gesturing to the binders on the table. "My legal team has prepared the necessary documents. Once we finalize the transfer of the majority equity into the new trust, we can move forward with this reorganization immediately." He didn't wait for a vote. He was so confident, so drunk on the power he believed he had already won, that he assumed the room was already his. He began his presentation, a rambling, jargon-heavy speech about the necessity of his vision. I didn't interrupt. I let him talk for 20 minutes, watching him bask in the attention of the very board members who were already holding the copies of his embezzlement dossier. I watched Vanessa, sitting at his right hand, looking at me with a mixture of pity and smugness. She had no idea that her own family's tax records were included in the files that sat on every seat in that room. When he finally paused for effect, waiting for the room to erupt in applause, the silence was absolute. I stood up slowly. "David, that was a very compelling presentation," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet like a razor. "But I think there are a few documents that need to be reviewed before we move forward with any equity transfer." I nodded to the board secretary, who stood up and distributed a new set of folders to every person at the table. David's smile faltered. What is this, Elena? We're here to vote on the reorganization, not to review historical data. This isn't historical data, David, I said, my voice cold and steady. It's an independent forensic audit of Sterling Dynamics' operating accounts for the last 18 months. It's a detailed accounting of the C&M consulting shell company that you set up to siphon corporate funds for your personal use. The color left his face. He looked at the folders being opened around the table. He looked at his own legal team, who were frantically flipping through pages and looking up at him with dawning horror. "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, his voice rising an octave. These are fabrications. This is an attempt to sabotage the board vote." "It's not an attempt, David. It's an exhibit," I said, gesturing to the doors. Two uniformed officers who had been waiting in the hallway at the request of the company's internal compliance department walked into the boardroom. The room erupted in chaos. Vanessa stood up, her face pale, and tried to gather her things, but the board's lead attorney stood up and addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," the attorney began, his voice calm and authoritative, "we have reviewed the evidence. It shows a systemic, deliberate, and criminal pattern of embezzlement by the CEO, funded through fraudulent consulting invoices paid to shell corporations. Furthermore, these funds were used for personal gain and to facilitate non-corporate activities. Given the fiduciary breach, the evidence of criminal fraud, and the recent discovery of the postnuptial agreement which triggers an immediate forfeiture of assets in the event of financial misconduct, the CEO's tenure is terminated, effective immediately." David looked around the room, desperate, his eyes darting from face to face, but he found no allies. The board members, the people who had respected my work, my strategy, and my integrity, looked at him with total, profound disgust. "You can't do this," David shouted, his voice cracking. "I built this. This is my company." "You built nothing," I said, stepping toward him, my voice unwavering. "You were a mechanic who found a partner who knew how to build a business, and you were too arrogant to realize that the person supporting you was the only reason you had a roof over your head. You wanted a trophy life. You wanted to trade the foundation for the view. You just traded the view for a cell." I walked over to the table and picked up the folders detailing his embezzlement and his offshore accounts. I placed them in front of him. "The police are here to take your statement, David," I said. "And my legal team has already filed the asset recovery motions. You don't have a company anymore. You don't have a house. You don't have a marriage. You have a legal bill you can't afford, and a record that will never be erased." He stood there, frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and pure, unadulterated fear. Vanessa had already slipped out the door, abandoning him the moment she saw the police. He was alone. He was broke. He was finished. As the officers moved toward him, David looked at me one last time, his eyes pleading for a mercy he didn't deserve. I didn't give it to him. I didn't feel a flicker of sympathy. I only felt the profound, crystal-clear relief of a woman who had finally purged the parasite from her life. I turned away from the table, signaling for the board to begin the emergency motion to name an interim CEO. I walked out of the boardroom, the sound of David's protests being muffled by the closing doors, and stepped into the hallway. For the first time in years, the air felt light. The crushing burden of his arrogance, his lies, and his betrayal had been lifted. I was not just reclaiming my throne, I was reclaiming my identity. I walked toward the elevator, the building that had been the epicenter of my life finally feeling like it belonged to me, and only me. I had built the empire once, and I was going to build it again, this time with a foundation that was unbreakable and on my own terms. The weeks following David's dramatic, police-escorted exit from Sterling Dynamics were a blur of intense restructuring. But for the first time in a decade, I wasn't just managing crises, I was building a future. The board of directors, now fully aware of the extent of David's treachery, had unanimously appointed me as the interim CEO. I didn't want the title permanently. My goal was to stabilize the ship, purge the rot, and prepare the company for a high-value acquisition by a global conglomerate that had been circling us for months. I worked with a clinical, almost meditative focus. I cleared out the offices of the consultants David had brought in, many of whom were nothing more than friends he had been paying with company funds. I replaced them with the loyal, hardworking team that had been with me since the beginning, the people who had believed in my vision before David had even learned how to hold a wrench. We rebranded, we tightened our operational costs, and we hit our production targets with a speed that shocked the entire industry. It was during this process of rebuilding that I rediscovered a part of myself I thought I'd lost in the garage days. I was sharp, I was decisive, and I was entirely in my element. I wasn't just the supportive partner anymore, I was the architect of my own recovery. I felt a sense of clarity that made the last 10 years of marriage to David feel like a fever dream I had finally woken up from. When the final acquisition documents were signed and the company was officially sold for a price that cemented my wealth for the next 5 lifetimes, I didn't celebrate with a champagne party or a high society gala. I took the morning off. I walked out of the building, the sun hitting my face for the first time that day, and I realized I had no one waiting for me at home, no reports to file, and no lies to maintain. I took that afternoon to drive back to my parents' estate. I hadn't been back since the day I left with David, the day they told me I was making the biggest mistake of my life. I stood before those iron gates for a long time, the weight of a decade of pride and stubbornness pressing down on me. I didn't go in. I wasn't there to apologize or ask for their validation. I was there to acknowledge that my parents had been right about David, but they had been wrong about me. I wasn't just a daughter who had made a mistake, I was a woman who had learned how to survive it. I left the estate, drove to the city, and checked into the penthouse I had purchased, a place that was entirely mine. It was sleek, modern, and completely devoid of the suburban warmth I had once tried to manufacture. It was a space designed for a woman who was the undisputed master of her own domain. My divorce was finalized in the absolute minimum amount of time required by law. David didn't fight back. He couldn't. With the criminal fraud charges hanging over his head and the absolute forfeiture of the equity he had stolen, he was forced to sign the settlement exactly as I dictated. He left the marriage with nothing but his original rusted tool set, a poetic final irony that I couldn't help but appreciate. He had traded his partnership with me for a life that crumbled the moment the money ran out, and he was now left to grapple with the wreckage he had created. I didn't hear from him again. I didn't want to. I didn't care where he went or what he did. He was a closed chapter, a lesson I had paid for with 10 years of my life. I kept the money, I kept the legacy, and most importantly, I kept my independence. I didn't need a partner to complete me because I had never actually been empty. I had simply forgotten how to listen to my own voice. I was no longer a wife, a host, or a provider for a parasite. I was Elena Sterling, the owner of my time, my money, and my peace. One Tuesday evening, the sky outside my penthouse was a vibrant, deep shade of indigo, the city lights below pulsing like a rhythmic, electric heartbeat. I was standing on the terrace, a glass of water in my hand, looking out over the city. I was entirely alone, and for the first time in my life, I realized that being alone was not synonymous with being lonely. I was stronger, wiser, and more powerful than they could have ever imagined. And for the first time, my future wasn't something that was happening to me. It was something I was actively, brilliantly creating. I stood on that terrace, high above the world, and for the first time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be, on my throne. A valuable lesson for the listener. If there is one profound, echoing truth to take away from Elena's journey, it is this: never build someone else's empire at the expense of your own worth. For years, Elena defined herself by the support she provided to her husband, believing that by sacrificing her own career and her own identity, she was ensuring the security of her family. She mistakenly believed that her loyalty would be reciprocated with devotion. But the people she poured her soul into were only waiting for the right moment to dismantle everything she had built. We often fear the end of a relationship, the end of a long-term partnership, or the end of an established image, because we fear the emptiness that comes after. We tell ourselves that we can fix the broken pieces if we just try harder. But sometimes, you aren't meant to fix the broken pieces. You are meant to clear the debris so you can build something entirely new. True independence doesn't just come from financial success or career milestones. It comes from the moment you stop looking to others to validate your existence. When you take your power back, when you refuse to play the role of the victim, and when you recognize that your happiness is not dependent on anyone else's approval, you become invincible. Do not let your kindness, your loyalty, or your success be the fuel for someone else's greed. Build a life that you are proud of, surround yourself with people who celebrate your strength rather than exploit your generosity, and remember that it is never too late to reclaim your throne. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. Have you ever realized that the person you were sacrificing for was actually holding you back? How did you take your power back and start your own new chapter? Let me know your thoughts and your stories in the comments below. If you found Elena's journey of vindication and empowerment as satisfying as I did, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another incredible story. Until next time, know your worth, protect your empire, and take care of yourselves.